info. She is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
Baby crib.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal. Hello and good morning or evening wherever you are across the 24 time zones, and welcome to the Ghost Signal. My name is Jeff and I will be your control operator, your Sultan of Spooky, your guide through the dark and abandoned places of the world. This is episode 13, The House That Screams Part 3, in which we will hear the conclusion of the saga of Stephen LaChance in the Union Screaming House. A few announcements before we begin. If you have a true ghost story for the Graveyard Shift segment or a twisted tale of terror for the Light in the Attic Patreon segment, please send it to the ghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com or visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and submit them there. If I read it on the show and you include a mailing address with your submission, I will send you a Ghost Signal sticker, a 3 a.m. sticker, business cards, the Starship Enterprise, a voodoo doll, and a DVD copy of Velocipaster. The mailbox is still empty though, dear listeners. The Ghost Signal Patreon is live if you so wish to contribute to the show in that way. There is a $1 tier called the Spirit tier, where you can listen to episodes ad-free on the same day as the regular episode releases. And there is a $5 tier called the Spectre tier, in which you also gain access to ad-free versions of the episodes, but also a Light in the Attic where I narrate creepypastas from all across the internet, and a short video where you can take a peek behind the curtain of the Ghost Signal. Are you a spirit or a specter? Go to www.patreon.com/The Ghost Signal Podcast and choose the tier that's right for you. There is also a Discord server for the Ghost Signal. Discord is free to join, so feel free to jump in anytime to say hi and interact with other listeners who share tastes for the paranormal. Go to theghostsignalpodcast.com and scroll down until you see the link. Click on the link, then click on the Join Server button, then click on the Join Now button and you're in. So download the Discord app, create your free account, and come hang out with us on the Ghost Signal Podcast server today. In the final installment of this ongoing drama, Stephen LaChance finds himself still tied to the house even though he has long since moved out. His new mission is to help a woman named Helen, the new occupant of the Screaming House. What happens next has scarred them both for life and will follow them both until the end of their days. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
When we left Stephen LaChance and Helen, the woman who had moved into the Screaming House after him, they had just run the gamut of paranormal groups and psychics claiming that they wanted to help Helen, but all they really wanted to do was help themselves. So Stephen had decided to form his own group, which he named Missouri Paranormal Research, or MPR, and they would not stop working with their clients until they were all happy with the results, be it simple information or complete spiritual removal. The activity in the house had begun to intensify. The house always seemed like it was on the verge of exploding like a volcano. One particular night sticks out to Stephen, in which he and Helen were in the living room when they heard noises coming from somewhere upstairs. As they went to investigate, Stephen in the lead with Helen behind him, they were cut off at the top of the stairs by it. The dark swirling cloud of smoke had appeared in front of him and above him. In any other circumstance, he would have instantly run away from the entity, but today was different. He was tired of seeing this thing terrorize everyone who dared live here, so he stood his ground. It began to swirl around him, making him nauseous, but he was firmly planted in place. In an instant it dissipated, and Stephen promptly passed out. Helen's voice brought him out of it, saying how proud she was of him for standing up to his greatest fear while he sat on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Every single day, several times a day, activity in the house continued its assault. Hot spots, cold spots, things turning themselves on and off, things disappearing and reappearing in random places, feelings of paranoia and illness all throughout the building. Then the events began to take on a religious tone. One day while Helen was out, her mother had called. This was back when people had answering machines, and Helen's mother left a message on it. Later that day when Helen called her back, her mother asked why she had such a strange answering machine message. Instead of Helen asking the caller to leave their name and number, it was a woman picking up the phone and reciting the Lord's Prayer and hanging up. Helen was absolutely mystified. The events taking place at the Screaming House were beginning to take their toll on Helen. She was noticeably tired all the time, and her smile was fading. Stephen was growing concerned that he was losing her to the entity in the house. One morning at 4 a.m., Stephen was awakened by his phone, which he answered groggily. It was Helen, and she was terrified. She had an almost uncontrollable urge to kill her husband, that she had a walking cane that was her father's right by her bed, and that Charlie would not have stood a chance if she took it and split his head open with it. She also said that her daughter Kelly was standing at the foot of their bed the night before, staring at them with vacant eyes. She looked like she wanted to kill them both. Stephen kept her on the line until daylight, trying in futility to calm her down. Whatever NPR was doing was not working. He needed to find her some serious help because if he didn't, someone was going to get hurt, but nothing could have prepared him for what was to come. Alex, the group's psychic, began to take a turn down a very dark road. He had what is known as an addictive personality, and he had begun to get addicted to the Screaming House. He had begun to age at an accelerated rate. He said the house was stealing sleep from him. His behavior had become erratic. He started chasing the spirits only he could see through the house and threatening them. For everyone's safety, Stephen had started to consider dismissing him from the group. The final straw had come when Alex asked permission to perform a bloodletting ritual in the basement to summon the entity and bind it to himself so he could take it out of the house. Stephen vehemently denied permission, and so did Helen when Alex asked her. He was asked to leave the house and never return, and Stephen implored Alex's sister Mary, who was the group's photographer, to get him psychiatric help. Alex did not like this outcome. He began to slander Stephen, Helen, and the other members of NPR online, and as a result, the original NPR had broken up. Alex had become institutionalized, having become homicidal and suicidal. He had let his guard down, and the house took control, destroying his life. The house then focused all its energy on Helen. She began waking up every day with bites and scratches in various places on her body. She had to lock her bedroom door when she went to bed at night to keep her daughter from coming in and staring at her and Charlie with malevolence every night. Stephen saw her slipping away with every bite and scratch, every disembodied voice and swirling black mist. It was winning. Stephen took to the internet again, this time knowing what to look out for. He eventually came to remember a case where the investigator had done battle with a demon and won. The man's name was Ken Sparks. Through the magic of the internet, Stephen was put in touch with Ken's son-in-law, Tom Gennara, who described Ken as an angel on Earth. He was not only a paranormal investigator, but he was also a noted demonologist and had investigated over 10,000 cases. The next day, Stephen was at the Screaming House with Helen, where they both called Ken. He answered on the second ring. He asked Helen to recount her story to him as much as she could remember, and when she was done, Ken explained that she had a demon in her house and that she needed a priest to come bless the house thoroughly and immediately. And when that was done, they needed to call him back and let him know if it worked. Suddenly, Stephen and Helen didn't feel so alone, like they might have a chance. The hunt for a priest was on. The problem was that Helen was not remotely Catholic. She was raised in a strict Baptist home and felt terribly uncomfortable walking into the church to ask a priest to bless her home. She felt like the eyes of Jesus knew that she had feelings of killing her husband and daughter before they killed her. But still she went to the priest, who was in his early 40s and sat under a painting of the Pope. She wasn't sure if the judgment she sensed was real or just in her head. After some convincing, though, the priest agreed to perform the blessing. On the day of the ritual, Stephen met Helen before the priest arrived. She was nervous, but she was in great spirits. The blessing didn't even take 5 minutes. He seemed to get more agitated the more he moved through the house. He wasn't performing the blessing as Ken had described, and that bothered Helen. He knew something was wrong with the house and did a half-assed blessing so he could get out of there as quickly as possible. And as soon as he left, the knocking from upstairs started, proving that the blessing had not worked. Stephen and Helen immediately called Ken to inform him of what had just happened, and he suggested that they perform the blessing themselves. All that did was to piss the demon off, and that day, the battle for their souls had begun. It was now Saturday, the day after the failed blessing. Saturdays were the days that Helen reserved for paranormal groups to come through, and this Saturday was no different. Among the people coming to the house was a couple from St. Louis, Bill and Trudy. Bill was talented at catching EVPs and knew how to speak to spirits to elicit a response. Trudy was a sensitive and had been a spirit communicator her whole life. Then there was Evan and Marie. Evan was a confirmed skeptic, and Marie, also as sensitive like Trudy, was determined to change his mind. Stephen and Helen had also invited a Christian women's group to attend that night's investigation. The idea was to flush out the spirits by stationing someone in every room, with Evan and Marie upstairs, Stephen, Bill, and Trudy in the basement, and Helen in the living room with some other attendees. The Christian women's group was positioned outside in the backyard. When everyone was in position, the experiment started. Almost immediately, the temperature in the basement started to rise, climbing almost 25 degrees. Stephen and Trudy felt the presence of something laughing at them, like it was mocking them. When Bill asked if the basement monster was with them into his EVP recorder, he received yes as a response. At the same time this was happening in the basement, the women in the backyard began to feel a change in the air. The wind changed direction and picked up, and it seemed to have an electrical charge to it. Then they felt the same presence those in the basement felt, like it was in two places at once. The women decided to get inside, and as soon as they began walking, they felt something begin to chase them. One of the women had the thought to stop and take a few digital pictures before she made it inside. Everyone in the house heard the women storm inside, so Stephen and the others went to see what the commotion was. After they explained their experience, the woman who took the pictures handed Stephen her camera to see if he saw the same thing she did. In one of the pictures there seemed to be a strange kind of opening wreathed in fire. Through that opening it appeared that several entities had come through and were gathered at the foot of something. Faces could be made out in the darkness, one being someone who looked like an old voodoo priestess, and she was looking directly at the camera. They all studied the enigmatic photo for a few more minutes and came to the conclusion that the entities were gathered at the foot of a burning cross. In horror, they all realized that they were looking at a mockery of Christ's crucifixion, and silence fell over the room. Proof that the haunting of the Union Screaming House was demonic was staring them in the face, and the skeptic Evan was a skeptic no longer. Through the many months of hosting group after group, there were a few standouts, but nobody exceptional. That is until one of Helen's guests gave her the phone number of someone who had helped them get out of their paranormal situation. His name was John Zaffis. In the world of ghosts and hauntings, he is a celebrity. He is a renowned demonologist, ghost hunter, and a kind of paranormal guidance counselor, assisting people who need help the best he can. He is sometimes referred to as the godfather of the paranormal. He was the host of the show Haunted Collector about 10 years ago, and is the nephew of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who he studied under for years. Whenever Stephen or Helen was at the end of their sanity and needed advice on a course of action, John was never more than a phone call away. The Union House had a way of giving people that visited nightmares long after they've left. It also knows how to get inside people's heads to find their deepest fears and use them against people. This is what happened to Marie, who had decided to join NPR as an investigator. She began to have dreams about the monster clown Matthew had seen so long ago in the basement when Stephen lived there. What nobody knew was Marie had an intense fear of clowns her whole life, and the house was tormenting her night after night, disturbing her to her core. Not long after the dream started, Marie told Helen, Stephen, and the rest of the group that her daughter was pregnant with the first grandchild in the family. Hearty congratulations ensued, and in the next few weeks, Marie's daughter would have her first doctor's appointment. The night before the appointment, Marie woke up in the middle of the night from the most lucid nightmare she had or ever will experience. In it, she found herself in the side yard of the Union House, surrounded by strangers who were all transfixed by something on the roof. That's when she heard a low giggle, a deep and evil giggle coming from behind her. As she turned around, she saw the demonic clown from her previous nightmares, but this time it held a baby by its feet. It laughed at her malevolently through long, razor-sharp teeth and stared at her mockingly from behind eyes that were glowing red. The hideous clown then proceeded to violently slam the baby on the ground like a sack of potatoes, and it laughed at her. Marie screamed at the top of her lungs for someone to help, but the people around her would not or could not acknowledge her. They remained motionless and mute. She screamed until she woke herself up with it. The next morning, Marie took her daughter to the appointment, where the doctor only heard one heartbeat. When she told Stephen about what had happened, he had a breakdown. How could a damn house do this to someone? It's a painful guilt that he still feels to this day, even though there was no way anyone could have ever known that would happen. The activity continued to escalate. Helen began to have conversations in her sleep with a black hooded figure that sat on the end of her bed, agreeing to do something, but could not remember what. What was she agreeing to? She began seeing a wolf-like animal outside of her bedroom window. When it looked at her, its eyes glowed yellow, and it had a deep guttural growl. It was accompanied by the black hooded figure who stood in the opposite corner of the room and told her in a whisper, "I'm here." And just as quickly as she saw them, they would disappear, leaving behind the smell of rot and decay as the only evidence that they were ever there. Mr. Zaffis, upon hearing about this latest episode, suggested that the two of them find a priest as quickly as possible. The sense of urgency could not be understated. In the meantime, life went on as it did for them as normally as it could. The following Saturday, all the usual suspects were in the house, conversing and having a good time. It was these little bits of relaxed normalcy that Stephen and Helen clung to, when even though they knew that the tide could change at any moment, that night they were just a group of friends enjoying drinks and simple conversation. That's when Helen told Stephen that she started to have strange thoughts about her husband Charlie, thoughts that she wasn't entirely sure were her own. She said she suspected Charlie of cheating on her, that if she ever found out about it, that she would kill them both. When she said this, her eyes appeared to darken with an evil glint in them, and her voice sounded a little off too, a sinister tone creeping in. A chill went down Stephen's spine, unsure if she was just being sarcastic or if her intent was true. He could not reconcile Helen, who was the typical grandmotherly type, always ready with a cup of coffee or a piece of cake, with being a cold-blooded murderer. He tried to put it out of his mind and enjoy the rest of the evening. That night's investigation yielded nothing new or exceptional, save for a few Class A EVPs Bill caught and a couple interesting photos. At around 4 a.m., everyone else had left. It was just the two of them having a pleasant conversation when an intense bright blue light flashed through the living room window, lighting up the whole house. When they got outside to see what the hell happened, all they saw was a huge black wolf standing in the middle of the street. It appeared to Stephen to somehow be darker than the night. As he puts it, with more energy than sense, he started to chase it across the street, and he wound up cornering it in the darkness of a neighbor's yard. That's when it turned on Stephen. It had the same yellow glowing eyes that Helen had described earlier, and it emanated an aura of fear as it bared its teeth and growled at him. Taken back by the creature's sudden defiance, Stephen quickly turned back, stumbling on himself, and ran back to Helen. The beast then turned tail and fled into the shadows, never to be seen again. He looked at Helen incredulously. When he asked her if that was the same animal that she sees in her bedroom, she confirmed it, and Stephen lost it. "You've got to get out of that house, Helen. That wasn't a normal animal. That was a devil dog sent from hell to grab you by the throat and take you to its home. You need to move now. I can't believe you haven't moved already." He didn't realize that tears were streaming down his face as he lost his temper, and all Helen could do, realizing that he only cared about her safety and sanity, was hang her head and nod. Thus began the last week she would ever live in the house. Sunday and Monday were both quiet and uneventful, which Stephen was thankful for. He had come down with a virus, at least that's what he told the kids. In truth, it seemed like he was suffering a kind of spiritual aftershock, having come face to face with the evil-given form itself. No matter how much he slept, it seemed to him that he woke up feeling more tired than before. He just couldn't recharge. Tuesday was much the same. Hours and hours of sleep, but no rest. Wednesday morning at 6 a.m., he was awakened by a persistent ringing in his ears. As he came to, he realized it was his phone. It was Helen, but her voice was different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on how. The story she was about to tell him, and the way she told it, was quite possibly the most terrifying phone call of his life. She was in tears, telling him that she needed to kill her husband and her daughter before they killed her, that she hears them talking about her behind her back. She could feel them staring at her when she wasn't looking. Her paranoia was taking over her rational brain, and if something wasn't done soon, somebody was going to seriously get hurt or worse. She started cursing, something Stephen had never heard her do. She accused Charlie of having an affair with a woman he worked with. Helen told him that she could smell her on him. She eventually snapped out of it and continued to talk to him as if nothing had ever happened. It was 10 a.m. when Stephen finally ended the conversation. He sat in silence on his couch for a while, trying to piece together a plan of action in his head. He had decided that thinking this hard on an empty stomach was counterproductive, and was on the way to the kitchen to fix himself a late lunch when the phone rang again. It was Helen again, or at least a twisted-up facsimile pretending to be Helen. Apparently, in the short time since their previous conversation, she had went to Charlie's place of business during his lunch hour. She had taken a butcher knife from the kitchen and drove down to him, pretending like she was going to take him out to lunch. When she arrived, Charlie got in her car ready for a pleasant lunch with his wife. What he got instead were repeated accusations of infidelity. He denied every question she screamed at him, and every denial made her angrier, until eventually she snapped, pulled the knife out of its hiding spot, and tried to stab Charlie in the groin, but to no avail. When he tried to escape from her, she did manage to stab him in the hand. She even tried to run him over as he was running back inside to the safety of his work. When she had finished telling him her story, he told her to start packing because he was taking her out of the house the next day. She had come to her senses and immediately broke down in tears. This was worse than it had ever been before. The following day at noon, Stephen was just returning home from taking Matthew to a dentist appointment when he heard the phone ringing. It was Helen in a terrified, frantic state. It had tried to kill her in her sleep, she said. There were scratches, bite marks, and bruises all over her. Without a moment's thought, he was right back out the door to the screaming house. As he was pulling out of the driveway, John Zaffis had called to warn him that Helen had called him too. But with him, she was not herself, and John was extremely concerned about not only Helen's safety, but the safety of anyone in near proximity to her. As he arrived, he saw Kelly sitting on the sidewalk with two of her friends. He offered a friendly wave hello, but in response, all three kids bared their teeth and snarled at him. He couldn't believe it. All three kids were growling at him like they were wolves about ready to strike. As he got in the house, he saw that Helen was packed and ready to go, but she looked sullen and defeated. He grabbed her by the hand and made for the front door. Just then he realized that Kelly and her friends had followed him into the house and were now blocking the exit. They were still snarling at them, but now Kelly demanded money from her mother and wouldn't move until her demands were met. Helen looked like she hadn't slept in a week and was borderline catatonic. Stephen knew the entity wouldn't let her leave without a fight, so he pushed his way through the kids, got Helen in his car, and sped away with the kids still standing on the front porch, growling at him. The further they got from the house, the more she seemed to snap out of it. He wound up taking her to a hospital emergency room near St. Louis. When the nurses took her blood pressure, it was 209/198, and her pulse was only 40 beats a minute. By all medical standards, she should have had a stroke, gone into a coma, or have died. The nurse looked at him and said, "You understand you saved her life." All he could do was nod. Later, a psychiatrist entered the room and asked Helen a few questions about her mental health. Her answers got her admitted into the hospital's behavioral health unit. As the security officers were escorting her, Stephen held her hand the entire way until they made him let go. Helen spent 1 week in the hospital. When she told her doctor that she believes she's living in a haunted house and that a demon is trying to possess her, he didn't think anything of it. The only thing he found wrong with her was a mild case of depression and would be releasing her to her family shortly. In the meantime, Stephen, with the help of NPR and John Zaffis, found a priest willing to help her by the name of Father Paul. The good father was what he called sensitive and had helped many people in Helen's situation before. Charlie and Kelly were picking up the pieces of their lives. Charlie had found them a new place to live, and Helen, it was decided, would go stay with her older daughter in Gerald, Missouri until she got better. They were out of the house and out of danger. A few weeks go by. Helen has good days and bad, but not that bad. Stephen told his NPR buddy Bill that he still thinks that there's something seriously wrong with her, that they haven't fixed anything yet. They both agreed to keep it to themselves, afraid that if they mentioned it to the other members, they would lose credibility. So here it was the weekend before Halloween. The 20 or so members of NPR decided that an outing at Zombie Road was in order. Zombie Road is a 5-mile stretch of road in St. Louis that has been closed off and is now basically a hiking trail through a forest. At about the 4-mile mark, there's a small train for children to take them the last mile. It's a nice scenic hike, but they were going in the dead of night, and Bill had gotten in touch with the man who ran the train and had gotten him to agree to take the group the last mile that night. By the way, it's rumored to be very haunted. Stephen had been on the phone with Helen earlier that day when she asked him if he had any plans that night. When he told her about Zombie Road, she asked if she could tag along. He was reluctant to agree at first, but then thought that some fresh air and friendship would do her good. As they met up at the start of the trail that night, the rain came with them. It was a slow, calm rain, and when they got under the tree canopy, they barely even noticed it. The hike started off nice enough. Everyone was chatting and having a great time, including Helen. Stephen was walking right in front of Bill, and when he turned around to say something, his heart stopped. Standing right behind Bill was a completely whited-out, glowing figure of a man wearing overalls. Seeing the look on Stephen's face, Bill turned around lightning quick and saw it too. He was a farmer from a previous century and was gone almost instantly. So much for a fun hike, he thought. A little while later, they stopped for a few moments to take a quick head count and take a break. They heard a rustling in the foliage just up the side of the hill from them. Suddenly, a shadow figure darker than the night ran at them and disappeared. The railroad operator who was hiking with them was at that moment a believer. One of the group members had even managed to get a quick picture of it. As they progressed, the night just kept getting spookier. They felt watched. They heard whispering coming from behind the trees. They saw shadows dancing just out of the corners of their eyes. Finally, they reached the train and climbed on board. The chill of the night began to set into Stephen's bones, and he felt that something just wasn't right. When they arrived back at the parking lot, people were chatting and joking. Everyone seemed to have a good time. Everyone, that is, except one. Helen was staring at Stephen with dead black eyes. His heart sank, and he knew he had to get her out of there now. She growled, spit, and cussed at him as he corralled her to his car. Just as they were about to leave, Bill, who had seen the struggle, went to go see if everything was okay. Just as he was about to reach the car, Helen glared at him with hell in her eyes and asked what the F he wanted. He stopped and slowly backed away as Stephen and the Helen thing sped off on the long road back to Union. She didn't say much to Stephen on the way home, but when she did, it was things like, "If I killed myself tonight, you'd forget about me by Tuesday," and to tell the people that were driving by to stop looking at her. When he finally got Helen to her daughter's house, she wouldn't get out of the car. She just sat there screaming obscenities at him. At one point she had started to scratch and bite at him, but as he was trying to fend her off, he noticed the shadows around the car starting to get longer and move around, like they were trying to get inside. He tried to start the car, afraid that he might not otherwise get out of there before something terrible happened, but the motor would not turn over. Abruptly, Helen jumped out of the car and stood among the shadows as the car roared to life. He left her in the dark that night, as she was screaming that his time had come, over and over again. When he got to his own house, Bill called to make sure that he was okay. He had seen what Stephen was talking about with Helen, and now he knew with certainty what Stephen was up against. Sunday, the next day, Helen's daughter called to ask if he had seen her mother. He admitted he hadn't and wondered why she asked. Apparently, that morning in church, Helen was having outburst after outburst, disturbing the whole service, forcing them to leave early. Then, when they got home, Helen had gone on a tirade never before seen, got in her car and hauled off to God knows where. Stephen got another call later that evening from her daughter, informing him that she had just gotten home. She acted like nothing was wrong at all and went right to bed because she was just so gosh darn tired. Halloween 2005. Stephen's two boys, Michael and Matthew, were putting on their costumes for school. They were both zombies that year, and were discussing plans for later that night when Stephen hurried them out the door before they missed the bus. With the house quiet once again, he plopped himself on his favorite spot on the couch. Zelda, the family cat, jumped onto his lap and fell asleep. The cat's purring put him to sleep as well. Around 8:30, he was violently thrown back into the waking world when someone started pounding on his front door. It was Helen, and she was in rare form. She was screaming at him to let her in, cussing at him, calling him every obscene thing under the sun. He was just about to let her in for the sake of everyone else in the neighborhood who had to listen to her screaming. He had his hand on the handle when he noticed Zelda was at his feet, arching her back and hissing loudly at the door. He flashed on something he had heard once about paying attention to animal behavior and decided to just wait out her tirade. The pounding on the door only got louder, and just as he was dialing the police, he heard her tires squealing out of the driveway. So instead he called her daughter, who in turn would call her mother. After about 5 minutes, she called Stephen back, telling him that under no circumstances was he to answer his door if she came back. She had a gun, and if he was to let her in for any reason, that she had it in her mind to shoot him. Helen also told her daughter that if anyone called the police, she would be dead before they got to her. She asked Stephen to call her mother just to keep her on the line until she could get to her. Helen was sitting in her car and was parked in front of the Union Screaming House, holding a pistol to her temple. As Stephen was talking to her, he somehow, through all the profanity and hate, got her to put the handgun in the glove box. She then told him that her plan now was to break into the basement, hang herself in the butcher shower, and let the demon have her. Then through the phone he heard a tapping on the window. Her daughter had finally gotten to her. Helen began screaming at him again. "Did you call her? I warned you not to." Calmly, he simply said, "No, you did." She changed almost immediately. "Yes, you called her, Helen. Don't you remember?" Stephen was taking a gamble with a kind of a Jedi mind trick, making her believe that she had called her daughter instead of her daughter calling her. What happened next was hard to describe. Stephen heard a long, mournful howl come over the phone, starting low and then gaining in intensity. In the blink of an eye, she was back, wondering why she was sitting in front of that god-awful house. She had been having blackouts, sometimes for days. She looked over at her daughter, saw the pain and sadness in her eyes, and agreed to go back to the hospital. With the help of hospital staff, Father Paul, and many hours of advice and conversations with John Zaffis, Helen is fighting back, and the fight continues to this day. Stephen credits his cat for saving his life that day. He immediately left NPR when Helen went into the hospital the second time. He felt he had made too many mistakes, and the whole ordeal made him want to forget about the paranormal for good. He began attending church again. Having seen pure evil convinced him that there must be a pure good to counterbalance it. He came to terms with God over the death of his sister and found peace. Father Paul once asked him if he still investigated the paranormal. When he replied in the negative, the father asked why. When he explained that the trauma just went too deep, Father Paul explained that maybe he was given a second chance to help others the way he helped Helen. That night he called Bill, ready to go back to the team. John Zaffis once told him that if he walked away now after waging a battle of that magnitude, that evil would come back after him sevenfold. Stephen then understood that this path is chosen for you, and once you're on it, it's impossible to leave it. In 2007, he left NPR to exclusively help people experiencing extreme hauntings. His website is www.stephenlachance.com. What an ending! As an epilogue, about 6 weeks after Helen finally got help, the owner of the screaming house, Mr. Winters, placed an ad in the paper advertising its vacancy. The family that moved in had 2 small children. When asked about the new tenants, he was reported as saying how nice it was to hear the little angels screaming again. And with that, episode 13 is complete. If you've made it this far, you have my heartfelt gratitude. I cannot thank you enough for choosing to listen to the Ghost Signal when there's so many others out there. Would you like to share your story? If you would, please visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and follow the link to email me, and I will put it in a future episode. If you would like to be one of us, visit www.patreon.com/theghostsignalpodcast to gain access to exclusive content. Join the Ghost Signal Discord server and hang out with other listeners from all across the globe. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson, custom sound beds by J.M. Scherf, video editing wizardry by Hale, creative direction by Cassie, and Patreon mastery by Brooks Bigley. And my name is Jeff, your friendly control operator and your ghost host with the most. The next time the Ghost Signal haunts your eardrums, we go back to small town Iowa, not far away from the Villisca ex-murder house. This time we just go a little further north, to Malvern Manor. Ending transmission. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.